Hello, fellow writers. I'm Jane, and this is Story Kitchen. How are you doing today? Are you drinking enough water? Getting enough sleep? I know sometimes that's hard for me, but I hope you are doing well. Today, I want to share with you some secrets to submitting SFF short stories. These aren't actually secrets. You can find these out on your own, but I thought it might be helpful for some of you if I collected everything that I've done over the past 4 or 5 years of submitting stories in one handy place that you can use as a reference. Again, as always with any kind of writing advice, your individual process is probably going to be different, and that's expected, and that's great. And the whole point of Story Kitchen is for writers to find out what works best for them. But sometimes you need a little bit of guidance or you need some examples. So I'm going to give you all the processes that I go through, and hopefully that will help you build your own. So first, why should you even submit? Of course, you don't have to. If you're totally new to writing SFF short stories, I do have a couple of videos on that, which I'll link to below, that will hopefully get you started and get you excited about writing. Rejections definitely do sting, not gonna lie. And I'm gonna talk a lot more about rejections a little bit later, but in the immortal words of Michael Scott / Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And the worst that can happen really when you submit a short story is that you get a no thanks, or I guess a no response at all sometimes. Maybe that's worse. And you know what? That's not so bad, right? If you want to write short stories and learn how to write short stories, then I think you owe it to yourself to see your short stories out there in the world. How do I know if my story is ready? I think a lot of us ask ourselves this question, and the short answer is, I don't know. I wrestle with this one all the time myself. The long answer is, if you've been following the advice that I laid out in my other video about getting started writing SFF, you've been reading a lot of short stories. That's one of the things that I advise you to do. And you've been reading stories in markets and probably getting excited about certain markets, certain publications that you really love, where you find stories that you really connect to. You're probably building a sense of what a published short story feels like and looks like, and you can start comparing your own work to the works that you see out there. And maybe you start thinking, you know what? That's kind of similar to a story that I have, or I think my writing style is of similar quality to some of the things that I see out there. And this is where I think reading widely is really important, because it'll give you exposure to a variety of styles, which will help you understand that there isn't one bucket that you need to fit into in order to publish a short story. In fact, I think there's a lot of different voices out there right now. That's super exciting. The second thing is, if you're lucky enough to have some sort of critique group or even a couple of readers who will look at your work for you, then maybe you start getting to a point where people start saying, this is really good, I think you should send it out. And that's a great sign that you're probably ready. But other than that, you kind of just have to go with your gut, I guess, and see what's out there. Now, I want to make it clear that just because you get a rejection or many rejections, it doesn't mean that your story isn't or wasn't ready for the market. And again, I'm going to cover rejections a little bit later, but I just want you to remember that. Where do I find markets for my short stories? There are 3 primary sources for that information. The first, and I think the most valuable, is this database called the Submission Grinder, and I will link to that down below in the description box. The Submission Grinder is totally free. It is an amazing database that is created and put together by volunteers, including David Steffen, who is also the editor of Diabolical Plots, a great SFF short story market. And it tracks every open submission call across tons of different genres, across lots of different kinds of markets. And you can log into that database, make an account, and start filtering markets by things like pay rate, average response time. It's crowdsourced information. This is an amazing resource, and it's so good at finding obscure, unusual journals, also anthology calls, and it also works for poetry. So I highly recommend that you log into Submission Grinder, get yourself an account, and start poking around on there. You can filter by word count, by genre, all kinds of stuff. There are other services too, like Duotrope, that do a similar thing. Duotrope is a subscription-based service, but it's also quite good, and I've used that in the past. So that's the first source of information about markets to submit to. The second is that SFW, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, publish every month a market report that lists all the new markets, submission periods, things that are open specifically for SFF. So their list is going to be less extensive than Submission Grinder, which is much broader, but that's also a great place to look, and especially for things like special anthologies or special themed issues and so on. So the SFW blog, and I will again link to that down below. The third source that I often use to find markets for my short stories are writing communities that I'm part of. There are lots out there. If you've ever gone to a writing con, and this past year and a half, there were lots of online cons, and a lot of them had Discords. And some of those Discords are still going and still active, and people will post in those Discords. There's often a channel for submission calls or gigs and opportunities or markets. Wonderful volunteer people will post submission calls that they see elsewhere. And this is a great source for things, especially things that have shorter windows or that are kickstarted. People who are running the Kickstarter will want to announce that. So this is a wonderful place. The ones that I can highly recommend that I'm part of are Cat Rambo's Discord, which is free to all Patreon subscribers, and I will link to that down below, and also the Dream Foundry Discord, which is public and free and open to anybody. And there are lots of others too, so just poke around, ask around, and find some writing communities that have a channel that's dedicated to that. There's also a Facebook group that I will link to down below that is amazing for listing open calls. That's something worth following too if you're on Facebook. How to decide where to submit. Okay, so maybe you've now found a list of markets, you have your story ready. How the heck do you decide where to submit from here? It can be a little intimidating because there are so many markets and there are so many parameters. This can either be a simple or a very, very complicated question. It could be as simple as, I feel like submitting to this market, and that's totally valid, of course. Submit to the places that you like, submit to the places you want to be published in, or whatever catches your fancy, of course. The other is to have a formula of some sort that takes into account things like average response time, the prestige of the market, the pay rate, how long that submission window is open for, how good of a fit you think that your story is for the magazine and its style and what they're looking for. A lot of those things are obviously really subjective, like prestige. But in my opinion, getting too far into the weeds about trying to consider all of those various factors when you're looking for a place to submit can get a little overwhelming, and it can sort of slow you down. And the thing about submissions is that the more you do, the higher the likelihood of getting published, right? It's statistics. It's a numbers game on some level. So I will pick a few of those factors that are important to me and then kind of just go with my gut for the rest. So for example, I always look at pay rate. For me personally, I think a professional sale is one of my priorities. So that means 8 cents a word or above. And there are several markets that pay 8 cents a word, 10 cents a word. A few pay more than that, but that's kind of the general sweet spot for professional rate. This is also called a SFW qualifying rate. SFW again stands for Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. And the reason it's called that is because if you want to apply for a membership in SFW, you have to have pro rate sales under your belt. There are a number of wonderful markets that pay what's known as a semi-pro rate, which is less than 8 cents. So that could be 5 cents a word, 3 cents a word. And those markets people love because they love the editorial style, they love the kinds of stories, they have some prestige, they win awards. So that might be a calculation for you too. But for me personally, I always just start with the top paying markets and run through those and then go from there. Because what I'm doing is I'm going to prioritize submission of my story to market A, and then I'll go, when it gets rejected, because chances are it will, I'll go to market B, market C, and so on. The other thing I look at are average response time. There are certain markets that have a very, very fast response time, and this is all logged in Submission Grinder. There are some markets that are like 24 hours or less. So sometimes I'm like, I just want to rip off that rejection band-aid, and I know I'm going to get the story back really quickly, so I'll send it there. Because sometimes you don't want a story to be locked in submissions for months, which some markets can take quite a while. 3 months, 6 months, a year. And that means that's all that time that your story isn't going out and trying out new markets. So, right, it sort of depends. I'm not saying don't submit to those places. It might be worth it, because a lot of those places that take a really long time either have really high pay rates or they're very prestigious. So it sort of depends. And then the third thing that I look at is how long is that submission window open for? Because there are some markets that are only open for, I don't know, a month, a year, or every few months they open for a week or so, and so on. So I want to make sure if I want to get into those markets that I'm paying attention and tracking those submission windows. And often the market website will tell you what their schedule is for submissions. So you can log that, keep that in your calendar. And I want to make sure that when Market Amazing Stories is open for that 1 week, that I have something for them, because I know it's going to be a while before they open again. There are other markets that are open kind of all the time, and that's great too. Anyway, that's my calculation. The one thing that I stopped paying too much attention to personally is what is the right fit for the market. Because honestly, I've heard so many writers say, wow, I sold my story to Amazing Stories Market, and I never thought that I would sell it there because I didn't think they would like my style. This is what they mean when they say don't self-reject. Don't assume that your story is not going to fit somewhere, or the opposite. Don't assume that your story is going to be a fit somewhere. There are dozens of reasons that editors reject stories. My philosophy is that as a writer, it is not my job to try to be a mind reader for the editor and try to divine what they might like and which story of mine they're going to want to publish. That's their job. So my job is to write the best story I can and send it out to as many markets I can and let them decide. No editor is annoyed by having submissions. That's kind of the gig. So just keep that in mind. On the other hand, sometimes you'll get a submission call that's very specific. It'll be like 19th century motor vehicle cephalopods anthology. And you'll think, oh my gosh, I have a story that's perfect for that got rejected from every other market. That is a time when you want to think about the fit, when they have very specific themed submission calls, and you want to make sure that you pick the right story that you have that's closest to that theme. And you know what? If you don't have a story that's perfect for that theme, sometimes it's okay to send it anyway, because the editor might see something thematic in your story that you didn't. What about sketchy markets? How do I know if a market is sketchy? What are some red flags? One thing you can check is Writer Beware, which again is a SFF resource, and I will link it down below. And sometimes when people have complained about a market's less than ethical practices, then Victoria Strauss, who runs Writers Beware, will write up a post about it warning other writers. That said, there aren't that many short story fiction markets that I can think of that are legit unethical. There are some that you will come across sometimes that have terms and conditions that might make you go, Like, for example, writing contests sometimes do this. Writing contests that have fees associated with them Personally, I don't like submitting to writing contests that have fees, especially fees that are, I've seen writing contests that have fees that are like $25, $30. I just think that's too much for a chance at winning a contest. But I don't know, your mileage on that will obviously vary depending on what the prize money is like and maybe how prestigious the market is and so on. I also don't personally like markets that charge any kind of submission fee for short fiction. Unfortunately, a lot of literary magazines do this. It's part of their standard practice. That fee is waived, by the way, if you're a subscriber to that magazine. So if you're a subscriber to literary journals, then go ahead and submit. I think in most cases, you don't have to pay the submission fee. But it kind of is a bummer to pay a submission fee just to get a rejection. You know what I mean? So unless that market is super, super prestigious, and that's really what I'm going for at that time, I usually do not submit there. Not to say that those markets are sketchy. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't have put them in the sketchy markets section. Literary journals are not sketchy. They just run things a different way than the SFF journals. In terms of actual sketch content, some red flags to look for are, for me personally, if the submission guidelines seem overly, weirdly aggressive. When you submit a story, and if you're lucky enough to get accepted, then you're entering into a business relationship with the editor. And I'd rather be in business relationships with people who are cool and chill and fun to work with, and not anybody who's going to give me weird vibes. You know what I mean? So there's that. There are also some terms and conditions, like back to writing contests, where they say they own the submission, whether or not you win. That's something to look out for in the fine print in the language. Other red flags could be if your rights don't revert, meaning that you're licensing your story to a publication. This is how most magazines work, is they don't actually buy your story. We say it's a sale, but it's not. It's actually a licensing deal. They license the rights to your story for a certain amount of time, and then after that, the story comes back to you, and then you can sell it again as a reprint or do whatever you want with it, put it on your blog, whatever. So they want to specify a term of exclusivity. That term of exclusivity can be anywhere from a year, 18 months, 2 years. If it's much longer than 2 years, then I would want to have a lot more money. But that's just me. So again, kind of looking at those sorts of things, I think. Oh yes, Writers of the Future. Writers of the Future is a contest. It is free. A lot of people submit there. I have submitted there and got an honorable mention. It is for writers who have not yet been published, so that's pretty great for new writers. That said, you should know that Writers of the Future has close ties to Scientology, and after having done my research, I personally stopped submitting there. Now I'm not qualified anymore to submit there, but I personally stopped submitting there. So do your research and make that decision for yourself, but I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so now you have your story, you have a market, getting ready to submit. The next thing I think you should think about is how are you going to track your submissions? Lucky for you, Submission Grinder already does this in an amazing way. You can just go to your dashboard and see all of your stories and your submissions. It's fantastic. But I like to keep my own spreadsheet, and I just use a Google Sheets. And down the rows side, I have every story that I've written. And then across the columns, I have the markets. And usually it's my favorite markets. I have a special section for special calls, theme calls, anthologies, one-shot kinds of things. And I have a system where I can see, oh, this story is pending, meaning that I've submitted it and I haven't received a reply yet, yes or no, at this market. And it's color-coded. But I'll link to a template so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And it's very simple. But I think for me, I like to just kind of see at a glance, oh, how many stories do I have out? What else should I be working on, etc., etc. I have another friend who tracks her submissions with index cards, and I also think that's really clever. It's very visual. Find a way that works for you and that's fun for you and that will be easy for you to update, because any kind of tracking method is worthless if you don't update it or use it. Okay, the next thing that I want to cover is the cover letter. A cover letter for short fiction is not at all like a query for a novel. It is way shorter, way simpler, and don't overthink it. My cover letter is literally 3 sentences, and I'm just going to read it to you, and I will also leave the text down below, but it's this. Dear editors, please consider my story, Jane's story, 3,000 words, for Amazing Stories magazine. I've been previously published in Great Stories Journal and These Stories Are Fine anthology. Thank you so much. And that's it. If you don't have any publications, just leave out that sentence. It doesn't matter. Editors don't care whether or not you've had previous publications. Seriously, they don't. If the submission call is based around certain parameters that have to do with your experience or your identity, for example, it's a BIPOC only call, or it's a marginalized writers call, or it's a queer writers call, then feel free to put that information in your cover letter. I usually add one more sentence saying, I'm a half Japanese writer who grew up in Oakland and Tokyo with an interest in esoteric Buddhism or something like that, if it's relevant to the story and to the submission call. But a lot of places also say that you don't have to put that information, and especially for queer people, because they don't want to force you to out yourself in order to write a queer story. So you never have to put that information in there if you are uncomfortable. That said, sometimes it's nice. It adds a little bit of context, especially if you're writing a story that does incorporate parts of your culture. So decide how you want to handle that when it's relevant. But seriously, that's all you need. Keep it super simple. Don't overthink it. So now that you have all that information, let's get your story ready. You are going to want to make sure that you read the submission guidelines and make sure that your story follows the format that they request. 99% of markets that I've seen will request Shun format, which I will link to down below, but it is a very, very standard manuscript format for literary submissions and especially for SFF submissions. Both Courier and Times New Roman are perfectly acceptable, and most markets will accept any kind of font that is legible. Don't use some super hard to read font, but most places are fine with any kind of fairly legible, easy to see font. There are some places that will request unusual formats. Like there is one I can think of that will request not double-spaced, but single-spaced. So again, just make sure you're reading the guidelines. Now, one thing that I have to caution you, because this is something that I have done more than once, which is that there are some markets that ask for anonymous submissions, which means that you should have all of your identifying info taken out. And that includes from the header, which I always forget to take my name out of the header. So please don't forget to do that if they request anonymous submissions, because otherwise it's just an automatic rejection and it's sad. Okay, so multiple submissions. Most markets do not want you to send more than one story at a time. Some markets have exceptions to this. For example, there are a few that publish both short stories and flash fiction. I know flash fiction is a subgenre of short stories, so they'll let you send one short story up to X thousand words and one flash fiction piece up to 1,000 words. So then you can do multiple submissions. And there are a few other markets that allow multiple submissions. Some markets also request a cooling off period, meaning that if you submitted to them and get a rejection, they ask you to please wait some time, a week, 2 weeks, a month, before submitting again. And that's partly to control the pace of their submissions, I think. This is why you want to keep track of your submissions and make sure you remember when you submitted and to where and so on, just so that these kinds of things don't trip you up. Simultaneous submissions is when you're sending the same story out to 2 or more different markets. Some places are okay with this. Most of them who are okay will say, please let us know in the cover letter that it is a simultaneous submission. So you would just add that at the end of your little brief cover letter. You'd say this is a simultaneous submission. And then the other protocol is that if that story gets accepted at another market, let's say market A wants that story, then you immediately withdraw it from market B. And that's easy to do either by writing an email to the editor, or if they're using some kind of electronic submission form like Submittable or Moksha, then you just log in and withdraw it online. It's super simple. I've never had to do that because I don't usually do simultaneous submissions. I don't know, I'm paranoid. I'm paranoid that I'm going to forget, I guess. But lots of people do simultaneous submissions. It's not a big deal, as long as the market is okay with it. Okay, so you've done all this work, you've sent your story out there. Now, what do you do while waiting for a response? Well, I think it's all too tempting to obsess, especially when you're starting out. You can start getting into a cycle of refreshing your email, checking your spam filter, and just kind of getting worried about your submission, getting a little bit obsessed. So for me personally, that I recognize that that is not super healthy or productive behavior. So I'll go on and try to work on something else. I'll have a novel in progress, or I work on other short fiction that I want to send to other markets. Or I might research other markets to submit to. Okay. So the big question, how do we handle rejections? I'm going to need a little more water before we tackle that. Like I said, rejections just sting. That's the reality. Sometimes they sting more than at other times. That's also the reality. It has a lot to do with how we're feeling, what else is going on in our lives, at least for me. And there was one week when I got 3 rejections, kind of bam, bam, bam in a row. And that was ouch. It is perfectly fine to stop submitting in order to stop getting rejections if you feel like you are in a particularly vulnerable state and you just don't want to deal with that. That is 100% okay. It doesn't make you any less of a writer. Sometimes we all just need a break to regroup and refocus on something, right? I have heard some writers talk about developing a thick skin. I don't know that I would characterize it that way. I don't think I have a thicker skin necessarily, but I have learned to frame rejections differently. So I'm going to share with you how I frame rejections so that I feel like I can handle them better than I did when I was starting out, when each one would really just punch me in the gut and make me feel like, oh God, nobody likes my story. I suck. I'm a terrible writer. Don't think that. Rejections are a sign that you are doing it. You are being a writer. I like to celebrate my rejections. I like to track my rejections. I set goals for rejections. Especially when I was starting out, I would say, okay, this month I want to track 5 rejections. Start small. Over the year, I want to have at least 60 rejections, whatever it is. And that way, it kind of feels a little bit like you are playing a game with your rejections, and it kind of makes the rejection feel more abstract and less personal. At least it did for me. The other thing that really, really helped me is I try really hard to identify the next market that I want to send the story to while I'm sending it to market A. So when I've identified market A and I submit the story to market A, then in my little spreadsheet, I will in the notes section write down the next market that I want to submit it to. That way, when the rejection comes back, because statistically speaking, that story is going to be rejected. It's just the numbers. Then I think, but that's okay because now I get to send it to this other market. And then I do, and I don't think about it that much, and it kind of takes the sting out of it and transforms the rejection from something that kind of feels like, oh, I need to reflect on this and sit on this, to an action, which means, oh, the story came back to me, I'm going to send it out again, if that makes sense. And that's really helped a lot. Now, sometimes I can't always do that. I can't always find the next market. Sometimes the story will have run out of markets. And then, you just have to sit with the rejection, and maybe another market will open up later. The third thing that I do is I remind myself that stories get rejected all the time. Good stories get rejected all the time. Great stories get rejected all the time. And a lot of times those rejections have nothing to do with the quality of the story. They have to do with the editor's taste, which is entirely subjective. Editors are humans after all. Or the editor might love your story, but they've just purchased another story that's too similar. Or the editor might love your story, but they can't quite come up with the budget for the length of your story. Or an editor might personally love your story, but think it's just not a great fit for the magazine, or doesn't quite see how it fits their theme if they're running a themed issue. They might think the quality of your writing is fantastic, but they just don't quite understand your story or connect to the character. That is not a flaw of the story at all. People have different reactions to stories and to art. You can never write a story that's going to connect with everybody. I suggest that you think of it as it's just this personal reaction. It's not objective. It has nothing to do with you, and try to move on if you can. And that's what I try to do. How do I know if I should revise a story that got rejected or just keep sending it out? This is a tough one also. And the short answer again is, I don't know. The longer answer is, okay, sometimes you might be lucky enough to get a little bit of personal feedback on the story from an editor. I have gotten feedback like, oh, the ending didn't quite work for me. Or on another story, I didn't think that the character developed enough in the course of the story. Again, those are personal reactions, and they're just opinions, and you can agree or disagree. In the case of that one story about the ending, I reread the story and that feedback really resonated with me. And I thought, oh, that editor is correct. The ending doesn't work. It doesn't land for me. So I could see what the editor meant when they said that. So then I went and rewrote that story, and then I ended up selling it to another market. In the case of the character development feedback, I didn't quite see what that editor was talking about. So, well, I don't know. Maybe they are right though, because I still haven't sold that story. I've sent it out to a couple other places. The thing is, revising a story for me personally takes a little more mental work than writing a new one. And as you progress as a writer, as I progress as a writer, it becomes harder and harder to go back to works that I wrote like 4 or 5 years ago, even if I still love the story. In a way, they're kind of too flawed, and they represent the writer that I was then and not necessarily the writer that I am now. And I have to think, are my energies better spent trying to revise an old story that represents who I was then versus work on something new and fresh that represents who I am now and what I'm interested in now? So that's a calculation that every writer has to make for themselves. And, sometimes, there are some stories that I have from the olden days, from years ago, that I still love. And if I have a little bit of free time or I feel inspired to, I might go back and revise them and think about them some more. But honestly, for me, that happens very rarely. When a story comes back to me with a rejection, I usually read it over one more time and make a few little tweaks, usually like little copy edits, or kind of tighten things up, but not too much. And then typically I send it right back out to that other market that I have already identified, because remember, I try to do that. Okay, now on to a fun topic. How do you handle acceptances and other non-rejections? Let's go with the non-rejections first. When I say non-rejections, I mean something like the editor says, wow, I really like this story. I can't buy it exactly as is, but if you'd be willing to make some edits and changes to it, then I'll consider buying it. This is also called a revise and resubmit, or sometimes an R&R. This is great news, I think. It means that there's something about your story that the editor really loved. The thing to remember, though, is that the revise and resubmit does not necessarily mean that they will buy it when you're done with it. They might still reject it. And I know that's harsh, but that's the reality and that's the way it is. So what I suggest is that you ask the editor what they're thinking in terms of what changes they would like to make. And if those suggestions really resonate with you, then you go ahead and do it. But you are under no obligation to do any of that. You could just say, you know what, thank you so much, but I think I'm going to keep the story as is and move on and find another market for it. It's totally up to you. So if you're going to do the work of a revise and resubmit with no guarantee that the story is going to sell at the end of it, then I think you only do it if you think the changes requested are a good idea and they'll make the story stronger, and or you want to work with that editor if they're a very skilled, highly regarded editor. And honestly, one of the joys of submitting short stories is getting to work with amazing editors who are just so thoughtful, and they've taught me so much about writing through their edits and suggestions. In my case, the editor was very frank about asking for a ground up rewrite. But I went ahead and did it because A, I wanted to work with this editor. B, the story itself was quite short, so a complete rewrite of it would not be as big of a deal if it were a rather long and complex story. It was a flash piece, so I was like, okay. And C, all the suggestions that the editor made, or the reason that they were requesting a ground up rewrite, I looked at that. It was like a page of notes. And I was like, oh my God, that's correct. These are all right. These are all things I should do in the story. So I completely agreed with the notes. So I went and did that. And sometimes they give you a deadline for it. Other times they don't. They just say, if you make these changes, resubmit when you're ready. So I worked with this editor, and in this case, I did have a deadline because they wanted it for a particular issue. It was a horror story, so they wanted it for a horror-themed issue. And then it sold, and that was fantastic and awesome. So I've only had a really good experience with revise and resubmits. Other writers have had more difficult experiences with them. It really just depends. So it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to. Never feel like you have to go along with the revise and resubmit. You are the writer, you are the expert in your own story. Okay, now on to acceptances. So you get an email from the editor saying, "Hi, Jane, we love this story. We would like to buy it." Typically in that email, there may be a few other details like when to expect the contract and so on, but sometimes that's just it. Now, I always respond to that acceptance email just because I want to make sure the editor knows that I have read it and seen it and I am okay with it. I don't want them to worry that it went into my spam folder or that I completely missed it. So I'll immediately reply and say, "That's great news, hooray," or something. Something like that. "I'm so excited to see it in your magazine." And then after that, the steps are usually there is a contract that will come, and you want to read that contract and make sure that it has no red flags. There is a wonderful sample contract, a model contract at the SFF, again, SFF with their resources, sfwa.org, and I will link to that down below. And you can look at that contract. And what's great about that model contract is they also call out and explain each item and why it's there and what it means. So then you can compare that model contract with the contract that you get. And here's the other thing about contracts is none of them are written in stone. You can always push back on something. That's within your right to do so. You probably won't have to with most established pro-rate markets because they've just been around for a while and they have contracts that are pretty well vetted by writers and editors. This is where you also want to check for any red flags, like how long is the exclusivity period. Once the contract is the way that you want it and they agree, the publishing market agrees, then you sign that contract and send it back and boom. Oh, I should mention that there are a couple different ways that contracts can be signed. Sometimes they send you a literal PDF and you sign the PDF and scan it in and send it, or use a digital signature. But also these days, increasingly, publishing markets are just using emails as contracts. So they'll say, when you reply to this email, we will take that to mean you've signed it. And that is totally normal. That is not sketchy. It's completely legit. So you might experience that too. Don't worry if the contract is email only. At some point after the acceptance and the contract, and often the market will tell you that, oh, we're going to be sending over some edits. And the edits can range from really simple copy edits, correcting typos or correcting little bits of grammar here and there, to slightly more developmental style edits like, hey, could we add another sentence or two to clarify what the character is thinking or feeling? That kind of thing. Here's the thing about edits is you are always free to reject any edit that you think changes the story too far from what you want it to be. A good editor is such a joy to work with. As I mentioned before, I've learned so much from working with good editors. I love working with good editors. And in my experience, a good editor will explain why they're asking for a developmental style edit. Copy edits usually aren't explained, but if they're asking for a different phrase or another sentence, they'll say why. They'll say, this is what I see in the story, and this is what I think would make the story stronger. After all, an editor wants the story to be good, as good as it can be, just like you do. So a good editor is a treasure and a joy. That said, sometimes the editor sees things, they're a different person than you at the end of the day. They might see the story as a slightly different kind of story than you thought the story was. So it is perfectly okay to reject any edits. And if I'm rejecting a developmental edit, then I will usually say it in the notes or in the track changes. And by the way, this is how an editor, in my opinion, should work, is they should send you your original file with track changes in Word so that you can see what they've changed, and then they'll often put a comment of why they made that change or what they're asking for. In my opinion, a good editor will be very transparent about that. I would be horrified if I got a fresh Word document of my story that had no track changes on it, but they just had made changes. A writer should have the final say in what the story's final form is. After all, it's your name on the byline, not the editor's name. So feel free to push back against any edits that you feel materially change your story, that don't feel like your voice, because that's the other thing, is voice is an extremely personal thing. And if you feel that any of the edits compromise the voice, the mood, the tone of your story, feel free to push back. One way to do this is to write STET, S-T-E-T, which is Latin for let it stand, meaning I want it the original way that I wrote it, please. And when I stet things, like I said, if they're slightly more extensive than just copy edits, and I stet those. And you can stet copy edits too, because sometimes copy edits will mess with your voice. Like maybe you're writing in a certain vernacular. Maybe a character is speaking in dialect, and a little too aggressive copy editor has flattened all of that dialect and that roundness out. You can push back and say, this is how the character talks, stet. Or this is the voice of my story, stet. I might push back on an edit that I don't agree with just a little explanation. Like, I don't think I want to clarify what the character feels because I want it to be more hidden from the reader. And anyway, 2 paragraphs later, it becomes clear what the character's feeling. What do you do if you feel like no one is buying your stories? You feel like you've sent out a lot of submissions, you're just not getting traction. I get it. I've been there. I was there. It took me a long time to break into the market to make my first sale. That's just normal. Again, a lot of what submissions are is a numbers game. So the more times that you have racked up submissions and therefore rejections, the higher your chances are of getting a sale. I would say don't get discouraged and keep going. This is where having a good feedback group or a couple of people could really help, especially people who are in the same short story circles as you are, who are trying to sell to the same markets, who are reading the same kind of things, who are interested in those same markets. It's really difficult, I'll just say as an aside, for novelists to read and comment on short stories, unless they also happen to love short stories. But I've met some novelists who are just pure novelists and they don't really read short stories, and so it's hard for them to kind of get into the short story headspace. So ideally, you want to find other people who read and write short stories too, and see if you can get some feedback from them. Is there something that you're doing consistently that you don't see, that maybe they see? And if you just kind of address that, then maybe your stories will have a higher chance of selling. But honestly, I would say just don't give up. It is a numbers game. It is statistical. Just keep going, keep writing new stuff, keep submitting, and you will get a sale. Let's say you have a story that's made the rounds, you've sent it to every market that is even conceivably a fit, and it's just getting no bites at all and it keeps getting rejected. Well, you can retire it. Like I said, you can retire it and come back to it years later or not. I have lots of stories in a file that I'm probably never going to look at again, and that's fine, that's just normal. None of that is a waste, by the way. You have been working on your skills with every story you write, whether or not you sell it. That's all just good stuff for you. Sometimes those stories will be perfect for a new market or a themed anthology call where you have this old story and this themed anthology call that has a really specific, strange theme comes out and you think, I have just this story. Then you can resurrect it and send it out again. I think that is it. Wow, we covered a lot, and this might be maybe too much information, might be a little overwhelming. If you have any other questions about any of this, if you have any questions I haven't addressed, or you have any follow-up thoughts or comments, please let me know in the comments below, and I will try to answer them if I know how. Hopefully, by sharing with you what's worked for me, it has given you some ideas about what might work for you and what you might try. One other thing I forgot to mention that I'd like to talk about is that if you ever see a call for volunteers for slush readers or first readers, this means the readers that read the submissions that come into a market, and they're kind of the first line of readers. Not all markets use them, but a lot of markets do. This is a fantastic opportunity for writers to learn more about the editing process and also to just get a sense of how stories work and don't work. When you're reading X number of stories a day as part of being a slush reader, you will quickly see why certain stories work and why they don't work, and it will also demystify the process for you a little bit. And honestly, I think it will build confidence because you see A, how arbitrary it can be that good stories get passed up, and B, what the competition is, if that makes sense. And you can start calibrating your expectations for your own work based on the hundreds of examples that you go through when you are a slush reader. Now, that's it. Happy writing, friends. Write those short stories, submit them. I want to see them in the world.